and well. Thank you for joining us tonight at Georgetown University for our public lecture, Ukraine and Postcolonialism with Father Cyril Hovorun. My name is Natalia Pavlik. I'm the president of Georgetown Interfaith Society, and I'm honored to be here with you today. I will be moderating our program tonight. We are very grateful for our partners and co-sponsors of this event, Department of Theology and Religious Studies of Georgetown University, the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, Embassy of Ukraine, Georgetown University Ukrainian Society, Śantik Foundation, and the Oriental Studies Circle from Ukraine. A few quick notes before we begin. This event is being photographed and video recorded. So please, if you prefer not to appear in some of the pictures, just let us know, some of the organizers, and we will make sure to accommodate your request. After the lecture and Q&A, we will have an informal reception with light refreshments in the foyer, so please join us for that. Please silence your phones. Before we begin, given the ongoing war in Ukraine and the human suffering it has caused, I would like to invite everyone to join me in a brief moment of silence or reflection in whatever way is appropriate to you, for all innocent people who have been affected. Thank you. A quick update to our program today. Due to unforeseen circumstances, our guests from the Embassy of Ukraine have delayed, and maybe they will be able to join us later tonight. So we hope for this, and we are grateful for the Embassy's support in this event. And we will proceed with the program as planned. First, please join me in welcoming Professor Dr. Andrew Prévost, Joseph and Winfred Amoruto Chair in Catholic Studies, Senior Fellow at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace and World Affairs, Professor in Theology and Religious Studies Department of Georgetown University.
Thank you, Natalia, and welcome everyone. As a professor in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, and as a senior fellow in the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, it is my great honor to welcome you here to this important conversation and lecture this evening on the topic postcolonialism and Ukraine. So I'm just going to offer a few opening remarks and reflections. In my opinion, now is a time for solidarity. It is a time for all people of goodwill to join together in struggles for justice, peace, democracy, national sovereignty, and human rights. Many countries have endured long histories of imperial and colonial violence, yet they have not acquiesced. They have shown their agency and resilience through courageous means of resistance. Today, the struggle continues in Africa and Latin America, Oceania and the Caribbean, Asia and the Middle East. The interdisciplinary fields of postcolonial and decolonial studies have documented, theorized, and supported such resistance efforts. When Europe is mentioned in this academic literature, it is typically identified as the place from which such racialized colonial projects have emerged or emanated. With good reason, scholars have called for the overcoming of Eurocentrism and the elevation of other knowledges and geographies. Nevertheless, the history of Ukraine, and more particularly the full-scale war that began nearly 4 years ago, when Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24th, 2022, reveal that anti-colonial theory and praxis have a vital role to play within Europe as well. As I said before, now is a time for solidarity. It is a time for all of us to stand up to bullies wherever they seek unjust power over others. It is a time to remember the prophetic words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote in his Birmingham letter, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are all interconnected. I've been thinking about this fact recently as I have read disconcerting reports describing the fact that over 1,400 Africans have been illegally conscripted to fight and die in Russia's war of aggression. The neocolonial precarity that has left Africans vulnerable to such misuse is sustained by the same will to power and the same disregard for human life that is driving the war in Ukraine, which by some estimates has now killed as many as 2 million people. So the crimes against humanity in sub-Saharan Africa and the crimes going on in Ukraine are of a piece. As in other cases of imperial violence, the terms of this conflict are asymmetrical. The former U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken expressed the situation clearly when addressing the UN Security Council. He noted, quote, "If Russia stops fighting, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends." The use of religion to rationalize such a lust for power has been particularly troubling to me as a Christian believer and theologian. The God whom I worship demands that we live in solidarity with one another and that we show special concern for the most vulnerable. In the words of the Magnificat, this God, quote, "has brought down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly." In closing, I want to express my gratitude again to Natalia Pavlik for organizing the event this evening, to the Ukrainian embassy and all of the other sponsors, and then also to all of you who made the time to come here today and to listen to this lecture. And then finally to Dr. Cyril Hovorun for sharing your wisdom with us. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Privor, for your kind words. And now let me introduce our speaker today, Professor Dr. Cyril Hovorun, who is a leading Orthodox theologian, and his work explores church, politics, and identity in Eastern Christianity. He is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at St. Ignatius College, University College Stockholm in Sweden, and the director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Father Cyril was the chair of the Department for External Church Relations of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and later a research fellow at Yale and Columbia Universities. He is an international fellow at the Chester Ronin Center for the Study of Religion and Public Life at the University of Alberta in Canada, and the visiting professor at the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Father Cyril is a member of the Working Group on Displaced Persons and the Culture of Encounter project, housed at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Cyril Hovorun.
Well, thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you so much, everyone who made it through the snow. I understand it's a challenge. I just I was in touch with my family and people whom I know in Kiev, and shared with them the pictures of the streets of Washington D.C. We have a very similar situation in Kiev, very similar weather. And first they complained about the situation in Kiev. They said, well, they don't do anything about to clean the streets, and can it be worse? And then I showed the pictures, and they said, okay, maybe. So thank you for making through it. And I should say that I'm going to experiment today. It's an experimental lecture. I was inspired to design this lecture after my trips to what we call Global South. Just a month ago, I was in Ukraine last month, more or less, and before that I was in Africa. I visited the places of suffering, ongoing suffering, the places of genocide, like in the Democratic Republic of Congo, an almost forgotten genocide that has claimed around 6 million people already, a lot of rape, a lot of violence, a lot of child abuse, child soldiers coming from the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. I've been also visited places like, for example, Benin, just a couple of weeks before an attempt of coup d'etat in the country. I was staying actually at the core of what would become the coup d'etat attempt. Actually, it was an interesting experience, but I was not affected by it. So I had a chance to see the place in Benin, which is called the Point of No Return. That's where the slaves were exported in masses to Brazil. I can't explain what kind of experience is. It's a hands-on experience, which is very different from any empathy that we may have by reading books, by even watching movies, whatever. That's why I believe it's super important for everyone to really to have an immediate experience of the place, to touch the land, to touch, the soil, the water, which witnessed suffering, which can transmit this suffering in a sense, to you. That's why I also try to visit the places of the fighting zone in Ukraine. I've been to the front lines because I believe it's important to really to put your hands on the things before you can talk about that. So I believe that I had some experience of colonialism in Africa. Before that, I was in the Caribbean region. From here, I'll fly to Oceania, to the places like Timor-Leste, probably one of the poorest countries in Asia, and the latest colony that became independent, with an amazing experience of the struggle against colonialism. I will be teaching at the Catholic University of Timor-Leste in Dili on a very similar subject. So basically, as I said, I'm trying to experiment, to do something that we usually in Ukraine don't do. We don't explain ourselves in the postcolonial terms. First, because we come from the same kind of prejudice that, Europe, the West, it was always a colonial power, was never a colony, never had this experience of colonization, and I believe it's a kind of it's roughly speaking it's right, it's correct, with a few exceptions. There are some places that experience colonialism in the worst forms of it, and after visiting those places, like in Africa, in the Caribbean era, in South America, I realized, I can explain in the same terms our own experience, what we've gone through. And I tried kind of to apply, this universal language of postcolonial theology and philosophy. And I found, by the way, that postcolonial theology is much richer than postcolonial philosophy. So when I started applying this language, I realized it's applicable. I can explain Ukraine to myself in these terms. And I can do something that we usually in Ukraine don't do, because usually in Ukraine we try to explain ourselves through our own narratives. They are self-explanatory for us, but they make us difficult. They make us struggling sometimes to explain ourselves to others in the global West, but even more difficult to explain ourselves in the global South. So one of the reasons why I came up with this language, with this synthesis, you want, well, to try to explain Ukraine in the global South. And now I need to start my presentation. I would also like to explain some terms, basic terms, to the audience, even though I know it is very well studied, also at Georgetown University. And thank you for your introductory words, for mentioning how important this kind of aspect of theology for understanding the world and ourselves. But still, we need to maybe to kind of define some terms, some words, and that's what I'm going to do as well. I realize that colonialism is like a pendulum. It seems that it has finally stopped at a gentle point, and we believe sometimes, well, colonialism is over. But then soon it will start swinging again. And I believe it's swinging in many places still, like in Africa, with neocolonial, sometimes roughly colonial, classical colonial attitudes. Some even European countries, not just like Ukraine, are in danger of experiencing new colonialism, like Greenland. And certainly this pendulum is flying over Ukraine. In my presentation, I'll discuss how postcolonial discourse, which is commonly used to describe political, social, and historical processes in the global South, is also applicable to Ukraine. At the beginning of the 20th century, 4/5 of the Earth's inhabited surface was colonized. 4/5. This meant that the population of these colonies could not independently determine in which way they would develop. This was determined in the metropolises, which were usually thousands of kilometers away. Some colonies were closer to the center, as in the case of the Russian Empire. Russia had almost no overseas territories, even though it sought to acquire them. Like, for example, I discovered, to my big surprise, have you heard about New Moscow in Africa? Who has heard? Yes, you have heard, right? There was New Moscow in Africa. And do you remember where it was? No, it was Djibouti. What is now Djibouti? There, the Russians tried to establish their own colony, which they called New Moscow. And actually, they established it as almost like a half monastery, as a spiritual mission. 1/3 of the settlers there were wearing like their cassocks and rasa, because they pretended to be religious people on mission. But actually, they wanted to conquer Ethiopia. That was the purpose of establishing New Moscow. But those were very kind of tiny efforts. Well, the Russians later on were just put to the military ships by the French colonizer, who said that this French Somali is ours. You have nothing to do here. Just go away, and they just deported the Russians from Djibouti. The Russians were not successful in colonizing Africa. In contrast, and by the way, this is in contrast to what Putin claimed. Putin claims that Russia never tried to colonize Africa. That is just plain lie, as usually what he says. But the truth is that the Russians did not proceed to colonizing Africa, not because they didn't want, but because they couldn't. They were much more successful in colonizing the territories nearby, next to Moscow, and one of them is Ukraine, but not just Ukraine. They also colonized the territories of Siberia. Siberia is a colonized territory, with a local indigenous population almost exterminated, and certainly having lost their identity, their language, their self-perception. It's well, the Russians always say, look at the indigenous people in America, what the American colonizers did to the indigenous people. But in the fact, the Russians did much worse to the indigenous people of Siberia, Central Asia, and ultimately Eastern Europe, including Ukraine. I'll show you a picture I've taken in a museum in Baturin. That was one of the old capitals of Ukraine in the period when Ukraine was a republic, when almost there were no most republics in Europe, across Europe. Ukraine was a republic. And Tsar Peter the Great, so-called the Great, we don't call him the Great. Well, that's how he's called also usually in the West. Peter Romanov, Peter the First. He decided to destroy this Ukrainian republic, to conquer, to colonize it. And he did this by destroying the capital, Baturin. It's in the north of Ukraine now. He massacred everyone, including children and women. He put the dead bodies on the crosses, like crucified bodies, and put them floating on the river Dnieper down to Odessa. Baturin was our first Mariupol, actually. What Putin did in Mariupol, Peter the First, the Great, had done to Baturin. And this is a picture depicting what they did. You saw these are the soldiers of Peter enjoying the tree, the fruits of the tree, with people hanging on the tree. This colonization, known as internal colonization, was essentially no different from overseas colonization. The only significant difference is that, unlike overseas colonies, which eventually gained their independence as a result of successful anti-colonial wars, most of Russia's internal colonies remain independent of the metropolis, and some, such as Ukraine, are still experiencing bloody colonial wars. I'll show another picture. It's from the National Geographic. It's a 1976 picture depicting the Soviet Union when it was kind of in its height, when America feared the Soviet Union most. And you see how many people lived on the territory of the Soviet Union. Those are peoples, colonized peoples, with their identity, their language, their culture, their histories, their religions. And almost everything was flattened, eliminated as an identity, as a language, as religion. Colonized people in the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union can be perceived as a colonial power, even though they pretended to be anti-colonial, they pretended to fight colonialism across the globe, but they colonized their own people. That is one of the paradoxes of the Soviet ideology. And at the same time, what the Soviet Union tried to do was to pretend and to project itself as a fighter, spearheading the anti-colonial fight in what now we call the Global South, what in the Soviet time they called the Third World, which was ultimately hypocritical for me. What is Global South? It is an imaginary community, to use Benedict Anderson's definition, so it's another imaginary community of peoples which often contrast with another imaginary community of peoples, that of the global West. Both the Global South and the Global West should not always be understood literally. For example, North Korea, which by certain, though not all criteria, can be classified as a part of the Global South, is located north of South Korea, which clearly belongs to the Global West. So in Korea, we have this very peculiar example of a country belonging to the Global West, like South Korea, and North Korea, which, well, identifies itself as a part of the Global South, and geographically, they are just not corresponding to those definitions. I've taken this picture actually in Korea. This is the borderline, literally, between the Global South and the Global West. I'm standing on the side of Seoul, of the Global West, looking across the river at the Global South. So in Korea, you probably have those two imaginary communities, the closest to each other, with a very clear demarcation line. And both of them, of course, are located in the Far East. So it's neither South nor West. The concept of both the Global South and the Global West are conditional generalizations that often negate the diversity and multitude of nuances in the countries to which they refer. Moreover, not everyone in the Global South likes to be identified with it. I personally asked many people in different parts of the Global South, do you like to be identified as Global South? Some of them said yes, some of them said no. So it's not a universally accepted kind of definition. Nevertheless, the generalization from which the concept of the Global South originated was formulated in the Global South itself. This happened in 1955 when a conference was convened in Bandung, Indonesia, which had just gained independence from Dutch colonial rule, with the aim of condemning colonialism. It was initiated by the leaders of the countries that had just been liberated from colonial domination, like President Sukarno of Indonesia, like Jawaharlal Nehru in India, and Gamal Abdel Nasser in Egypt. At the Bandung Conference, a common identifier for former colonies was proposed. Does someone know what was the identifier of Bandung? Continentality. Tricontinental identity. This happened here. I've been to Bandung, actually. There is a beautiful Catholic university, a small one. You should go there, I advise. It's really good. And it's Catholic. And it's a place where actually the idea of the Global South was born, together with the idea of anti-colonialism, in a sense. And as I said, this idea of the Global South was born, its kind of grandfather of this idea is the idea of tricontinentality. The Bandung Conference gave rise to the non-aligned movement, when former colonies avoided joining either countries with developed market economies, which the socialist bloc called capitalist countries, and some of which had recently been the metropolises for these colonies, or to the countries of the socialist camp, which raised the slogans of anti-colonialism in the struggle of the victory of for the victory of communism. In other words, it was a movement of countries that avoided direct participation in the Cold War. In 1952, a French scholar Alfred Sauvy, this guy, called them the Third World countries. He used the French social model of the three states. That, you know, there is like the ruling state, aristocracy, clergy, and like citizens. And he just extrapolated this idea of the states, French states of the French society upon the world. And originally this idea of the third world comes from a very colonial setting, from a very European Western setting of the French society. This term, third world, stuck better than tricontinentalism. But that's why I ask you if someone heard of tricontinentalism, and it seems you don't, because it is kind of it is in oblivion now, was substituted by the concept of the third world. The 1955 conference marked the symbolic end of a 70-year era that had symbolically began with another conference in Berlin in 1885. That was a landmark event. When Otto von Bismarck convened this conference, Berlin conference, his goal was to establish something close to German Ordnung in Africa, order. Colonialism there in Africa was chaotic, was a mess, and often accompanied by armed conflicts between European powers. So basically, Bismarck wanted to establish some kind of order in Africa among the colonial powers, not for the sake, not for the good of the people there in Africa, but for the good of the colonial powers. For me, it is somehow reminiscent of the 30 Years' War in Europe in the early 17th century, when everyone fought against everyone else. And as a result, in 1848, a peace treaty was signed in Westphalia, in Münster and Osnabrück, that ended the war and established the principle of sovereignty of European states as we know it until now, even today. This is the city hall in Münster where the Peace of Westphalia was signed. And basically, in my interpretation, the Peace of Westphalia was a kind of precedent for the Conference of Berlin. In Münster and Osnabrück in the 17th century, what they decided to do, look, we need to respect the borders of the states. We should not transpass the borders. But when it comes to the colonies, because colonies already existed there, it was no one's land. Every European country was allowed to do whatever they wanted in Africa and elsewhere, in the global south, like in Brazil, in South America, in Asia, and elsewhere. And the Conference of Berlin actually tried to catch up with the situation and to establish the same order of Westphalia, basically, but now in the global south. Of course, the the Conference of Berlin Conference, established some kind of sovereignty of the European countries over Africa, but never acknowledged a possibility, even an idea of a possibility of sovereignty for the African peoples themselves. Even the brightest minds in abolitionist movement, in the anti-slavery movement, didn't think about the possibility of the Africans having their own sovereignty and taking care of themselves at the time. So that was a kind of optimization, as we call it now, of the colonial rule. And as a result of this optimization, while by 1884, the time of Berlin Conference, Europeans controlled about 10% of Africa, from 1884 to 1914, they gained control over 90% of the continent. A dramatic surge, as a result of Ordnung established, imposed upon Africa. The global south was an arena of competition not only between European empires, but also between imperial churches, which sent their missionaries there. And we all know this story of imperial churches with the empires traveling on the shoulders of the missionaries and the churches to the colonies. And there was also competition between the churches, just like the competition between the imperial powers. And in order to transform unfair competition into cooperation, another conference was convened in Edinburgh in 1910, which launched a global ecumenical movement to restore the unity of the Christian churches. Nowadays, we celebrate, like in 2010, there was a huge celebration of Edinburgh Conference, and as a kind of a centennial anniversary of the ecumenical movement. And from the perspective of the modern ecumenical movement, which is deeply anti-colonial, the Edinburgh Conference looks like anti-colonial as such, but it was not. It was just the opposite. It was super colonial conference. It was exactly in the spirit of colonialism, which is a paradox. So when we come from the assumption, modern assumption, the ecumenical movement is anti-colonial, we kind of extrapolate this assumption upon the Edinburgh Conference. And this is a very wrong extrapolation, because it was colonial, because it exactly tried to ossify the colonial situation in Africa and elsewhere, now from the perspective of the churches. So the churches should stop fighting each other over the flocks, but they were still colonial powers, enablers of colonialism. Of course, the history of colonialism did not begin with the Berlin Conference, although it gave it its most developed form. The history goes back to antiquity, when the Phoenicians, Greeks, and Romans actively colonized lands near and far. Then the Spanish and Portuguese initiated European colonialism in the modern era. They sought to continue the crusades and the reconquistas, which were also forms of crusades. And it's interesting, when I started kind of delved into this question, I realized that, and I found confirmation in other studies, that basically modern colonialism is a continuation of crusades and reconquistas. Because when the Portuguese started kind of finding routes to India, they were driven by the spirit of reconquista to regain their lands in northern Africa, what is now Morocco and Algeria, and to liberate, as they call it, the routes from the Ottoman, the trade routes from the Ottoman kind of control and Arab control. And it was like in the spirit of fighting against the infidels. right? That they started the process of modern colonization. So there is a very direct link between colonization and the idea of crusades and reconquistas. So that is how Africa was discovered, which Vasco da Gama circumnavigated with the task from the Portuguese king to find the kingdom of priest John, Prester Johannes, and to establish the import of spices from India. And unlike Columbus, he managed to reach the real India. Columbus, as you know, went the wrong way, bypassing the Arab-Venetian monopoly on trade. The first African colonies were Portuguese, and their main mission was to spread Christianity. I went to Kenya, and in Mombasa, I found this what they called the Jesus Fort. Maybe some of you have been there, or you've heard of it. It's one of the earliest colonial edifices in Africa. It was built in the 16th century by the Portuguese, exactly to establish their colonial rule and the church. That's why they call the fort Jesus Fort, not just any fort, that Jesus Fort. And I found this graffiti. It's actually 16th century graffiti with the Portuguese ships, galleons, bringing soldiers and missionaries to Africa. When Spain and Portugal began to decline after the Golden Age in the 15th, 17th centuries, they were replaced by new maritime superpowers, Holland and England. For them, colonization was also about preaching Christianity and trade. Scottish missionary David Livingstone, who discovered the Congo River, formulated this as the principle of the 3 C's: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. Both Holland and England consistently implemented these principles in their colonial practices. The main instrument of these practices were the so-called Indian companies, the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, and the English East India Company, founded in 1600. They became states within a state, or rather states outside their own states. Both the companies and their countries usually competed with each other, as can be seen in the case of New York, as you probably know, which was originally New Amsterdam, but was then captured by the English and renamed after its new owner, James, the Duke of York, brother of King Charles II. So, because of the Duke of York, it became New York. The struggle for independence of the English colonies, and of course the competition between English and Dutch, is very well illustrated in the culture. The struggle for independence of the English colonies in North America 2.5 centuries ago marked the beginning of decolonization, which developed in parallel with progressive colonization. So it was a process of colonization, ongoing colonization, and America became one of the first instances of decolonization, which then became an instance of colonization, of course. Then a similar process spread to South America, most of which freed itself from Spanish and Portuguese rule during the 19th century. I visited in Bogota, in Colombia, this place. It's interesting. It was the residence of Bolivar, Simón Bolivar, and it has the flags of all the countries that he managed to kind of decolonize, modern countries, including Colombia, Venezuela, Ecuador, Peru, Panama, Bolivia. Although independence from London became the cornerstone of American identity, the United States began internal colonization to the West, just as the Russian Empire colonized everything to the East at the same time. So it was a kind of a synchronic process, the colonization of internal kind of adjacent territories by the Russian Empire and the colonization of adjacent territories by the American Republic. America also began to seize territory by military means, including in wars with Spain over the Philippines and Cuba, as well as with former New Spain, Mexico, seizing the territories of modern Texas, Arizona, and California. And at the end of the 19th century, the United States annexed the Hawaiian Islands. And at the beginning of the 20th century, it annexed the Panama Canal Zone. It also adopted the Monroe Doctrine, which I believe is purely neocolonial. with all its iterations, Monroe Plus, Donroe, and whatever. Perhaps it is somewhere in the shared history of internal colonization that we should look for the support of modern Russian colonialism that so surprises us today. I mean, this absolutely appalling support from the United States when it votes together in the UN, together with Cuba, North Korea against Ukraine. We are just shocked and we cannot explain, but maybe this shared internal colonialism experience can explain us. Actually, here in DC, I think yesterday I listened to Ambassador Waltz, the U.S. representative to the UN, who does this. I mean, voting and securing, those votes. This is the picture I've taken in Panama. Oh, sorry, it's Mexico, and the next one is Panama. The First and especially the Second World Wars were powerful catalysts for reshaping colonization and colonialism. This process primarily affected Europe, where large empires collapsed, the Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian empires. As a result, many previously colonized peoples, including the Ukrainian people, who had been divided between the Habsburg and Romanov empires, were given a chance at freedom. This chance was never realized because Ukraine was swept by a new wave of colonization, not in the name of the empire as such, but in the name of an ideology that became a tool for the expansion of a new quasi-empire, the Soviet Union. Although it declared its fight against classical colonialism, it itself became the driving force behind hybrid colonization and hybrid colonialism. And I just want to show you a picture. It's a picture from Holodomor, the artificial famine that was imposed by the Soviets upon Ukraine in the early 30s that claims up to 7 million people dead, including those children. And this is, for us, it's a result of this colonization, new wave of colonization, Soviet colonization. On the one hand, they took the bread and the resources from the Ukrainians, and they helped the global Soviet revolution, the Third International, pretending that they are fighting against, Western imperialism. But they did this at the expense of this. So this is the other side of the Russian ostensible anti-colonial, anti-imperial efforts, globally. That's how we experienced it in Ukraine. Opposed to communist ideology, fascism also became the basis for a new attempt at colonization. Mussolini tried to colonize both overseas and neighboring countries. He started a brutal war in Ethiopia and invaded neighboring Albania, Greece, and Yugoslavia. Hitler did the same. Ukraine, which had already suffered from Soviet colonization, also fell victim to Hitler's colonial efforts. His fight for Lebensraum, for the vital space for the Third Reich, was nothing else but a colonial effort. And these are the results of it. This is not Babi Yar. This is what the Nazis did to the Ukrainians. They killed 5 to 7 million civilians, Ukrainians, including my great-grandfather. He was killed by the Nazis, for example. My grandmother was driven to Germany as a slave girl. That's why in Africa I say, I am a grandson of a slave. You would not believe that you could see a white grandson of a white slave. I am. Because my grandmother was forcefully removed from Ukraine and brought to Germany to work for a German family. So it's another kind of colonization coming now from the Nazis that we experienced, and the entire Ukraine was occupied by the Nazis, as you probably know, and was colonized in that way. And of course, we cannot not mention the Jews who suffered as a result of this colonization. This is Babi Yar. That's where up to 150,000 Jews, people, mostly Jews, were killed in mass. Although Nazi Germany's main colonization efforts were directed at Europe, it also sought to restore and expand its overseas possessions. So basically, Germany, the Third Reich, acted like the Soviet Union, trying to colonize their neighbor territories. or like the United States. As the country, Germany, that lost World War I, Germany lost its colonies in Africa, the German Africa, which came under the protectorate of the countries that won the war, England and France. France and England also divided the Middle East mandates between themselves. The Third Reich, having captured France and intending to defeat England, sought to restore and expand its colonial possessions in Africa as well. Upon coming to power, Hitler immediately began demanding that Germany regain its possessions in present-day Namibia, Rwanda, Burundi, Tanzania, Cameroon, and Togo. In 1934, the NSDAP, the Nazi Party, colonial policy department was even created to manage those territories, those future colonies. Subsequently, the Führer developed the Central Africa Plan, Mittelafrika Plan, according to which the Reich was to form a continuous belt of possessions across the entire continent from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. It was to include the Belgian Congo, French Equatorian Africa, and parts of the British possessions in Nigeria, Kenya, Uganda, and Zimbabwe. The Nazis initially planned to use their African colonies to solve the Jewish question, as they call it. They wanted to bring all European Jews to Madagascar. Have you heard of that plan? That was the plan originally, to bring all the Jews to Madagascar. But then it was too expensive and too messy, and they decided to solve the problem in Europe, in-house, as it were. What the world tried to do after the First World War, but failed to achieve, was only completed after the Second World War. When the old colonial system formed at the Berlin Conference began to be gradually dismantled. Colonial theory and practice became toxic and were replaced by postcolonial theories and practices. This paradigm shift in thinking and action was recorded at the aforementioned conference in Bandung in Indonesia. After the fall of the Soviet bloc, postcolonial theories, which incidentally have increasingly identified themselves as postcolonial since the 1990s, have focused on what has come to be called decolonization. It is about how, having freed oneself from the colonial yoke, to get rid of its consequences in the conscious and subconscious mind. That's how we arrive at postcolonialism. I think I took this picture in the Caribbean. So this term, decolonization, can be used to describe the policies of memory also in Ukraine. We call it the policy of decommunization. That's how we brand it, kind of coin it ourselves. But in fact, it is the policy of decolonization. And it's quite classical. It's nothing new. Even though sometimes we believe we are quite unique and, we do something unprecedented, but we do just what other former colonial powers try to do, to decolonize their minds and their histories. The fall of the Soviet Union created the conditions for the renewal of not only post-colonialism, but also colonialism. The updated version of the latter is called neocolonialism. Neocolonialism is not just a new colonialism. It's a bit trickier than that. It means that the colonial power does not exercise this power directly, but indirectly, through the proxies, through business, economy, political powers, different influences which are not direct. The concept as such was first introduced by Jean-Paul Sartre. Hence is my kind of take on this. That's what I discovered when I had many conversations with the theologians in Africa. Actually, I had one today in the morning. I was conversing with theologians from the University of Botswana. And it's a continuation of the conversation that we had before. And when I sensed that actually they sense themselves, that the language they try to speak to explain themselves to us, the postcolonial language, it's not their language. It's the Western language, which was adopted by them, yes, but originates from the West. So it's another paradox of the postcolonial theology, at least, or philosophy in when it comes to Sartre, that originally the language was coined again by the colonial powers, even though it is anti-colonial. So it's one of the paradoxes of the postcolonial, I think, philosophy and theology. Of course, later on, very soon, this language was adopted as their own by the local people, like in Africa. And that's how, for example, the first president of independent Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, analyzed it in more detail, much better than Sartre, actually, in his book Neocolonialism, which became a bestseller published in 1965. According to his conclusion, the formal independence of a colony does not guarantee its informal dependence on the former or any other metropolis. Such dependence remains primarily economic, but it also can be political through external influence on internal political processes. This is how neocolonialism is understood today. In view of this, it is not Africa's old metropolises that are increasing their neocolonial influence on Africa, but new ones. And that is another paradox of neocolonialism. Now we are facing new neocolonial powers. It's not the West so much anymore. It's China and Russia. Wherever you go in Africa, you see everywhere China. In Zambia, which I visited, they started paying in yuans, for example, in the marketplaces. When I was flying from Lusaka, from Zambia to Botswana, half people on the plane were Chinese. Half of the Chinese people were Communist Party members. You always see them. They look differently from the rest of Chinese. For Ukraine, Russia is an old metropolis that is also trying to restore its influence here. After liberation from formal colonial dependence on Moscow, as we can interpret it from the point of view of postcolonial theories, this independence was achieved in 1991. We in Ukraine have had many opportunities to see the truth, in the words of Indonesian President Sukarno, which he said at a conference in Bandung. Colonialism is not dead. It has only changed its clothes. From the early years of our independence in Ukraine, Russia began to apply classic neocolonial methods to Ukraine, using energy resources as a tool of political dictatorship, making our economy dependent on itself, creating actually corruption and exporting corruption. Corruption became an instrument of neocolonization, just like what China does in Africa, basically. Bribing politicians, expanding corruption, disseminate corruption, and in this way, enhancing its neocolonial presence. That's exactly what Russia did in Ukraine in the period of independence. Of course, it's not that we are not to be blamed for corruption. We have accepted it, but the source was extraneous. It came from Russia. Also, Russia created pocket political projects. In other words, Moscow did not invent anything new, but simply followed the textbooks of neocolonialism. But each time, the Ukrainian people stood in its way, primarily through the Maidans as the most effective tool of decolonization. We had 3 Maidans, what we call the Maidans. One in 1991, all of them were student Maidans. They started with the input of the students. And I would interpret our Maidans as anti-colonial events. The first one, 1991, when the students stood against against signing a new Soviet treaty to reassemble the Soviet Union. The second one happened in 2004-2005, the so-called Orange Revolution. The third one, it was the Revolution of Dignity, more recently 2013-2014, following which Russia started its aggression against Ukraine. So all those Maidans were basically the attempts to decolonize, to resist the neo-colonial effort of Russia. They were anti-colonial phenomena. So because owing to the Maidans, neo-colonial projects of Russia failed in Ukraine. So Russia tried to establish different proxy instruments to control Ukraine, political life, economy, and so forth. And the Maidans prevented this from happening. What Russia did as a result? It started colonial efforts. Colonial efforts meaning to establish direct rule, direct control upon the country. That's how the big war began in Ukraine. This war started in 2014, immediately, several days after the victory of the Maidan. Putin realized, even though probably he did not put it in this way, I mean, in the terms of post-colonial philosophy, but actually he intuitively played exactly the game of all colonial powers. If neocolonialism fails, go back to colonial efforts, go back to the colonial wars. That's how 2014 happened with the annexation of Crimea and the attempt to establish the proxy republics, the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republics. I should say that those two republics, which were like puppet republics, they were proxy entities, political entities for Putin. Formally, they were kind of independent. And those republics were kind of neocolonial, because modern neocolonial powers, when they try to reestablish neocolonial control, they set up such kind of quasi-independent entities. Like, for example, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, nowadays the so-called M23 group, which has occupied the eastern part of Congo. It's formally independent, but it's really a proxy of Rwanda. And this is the case. It's very similar to what Putin tried to do in Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. It's like our M33 groups in Ukraine. On the one hand, Putin thus had Crimea directly controlled by Russia as a new colonial situation with new sufferings by the colonized people, primarily the Tatars, which are Muslims, the local indigenous population, Tatar population, who are very close to Ukrainians. We feel very close with them. That's one of the reasons why we, as Christians, feel so close to Muslims nowadays in Ukraine. We demonstrate really remarkable solidarity together with the Jews. We don't have interreligious conflicts at all in Ukraine. We have inter-Orthodox conflicts a lot within the Orthodox groups. But when it comes to interreligious, interfaith situation, that's why Natalia is really can teach you how to have like interreligious space coming from the Ukrainian experience. We have really a remarkable interreligious situation in Ukraine, because we know that the Muslims in Crimea are suffering from this new colonial effort by the Russian forces, and because Crimea is a new colony, basically. But within Donbass, it was more peculiar, more kind of nuanced. So Putin first tried to establish those two republics as neocolonial constructs in order to implant them into the Ukrainian political body, to control the Ukrainian political body through his proxy quasi-independent groups. Then it didn't work because we resisted. That was the main reason of our war has been the main reason since 2014. We resisted this kind of occupation of this territory by the Russians and resisted the implantation of those entities, political entities, into our political body. When Putin again failed to construct this neo-colonial situation in the east of Ukraine and Donbass, he came back to the kind of raw, uncovered colonial situation. He started the big war in February 2022, which is classically colonial war. It's about establishing the direct control over the colonized territories, of the territories that he wants to colonize. So you see, Putin plays all the time with the neo-colonial and colonial wars. Crimea, a colonial war. Donbass in 2014, neo-colonial. When neo-colonial situation failed for him, he started the big war in order to occupy the entire country, and he does not stop. His purpose is to occupy Ukraine. His purpose is not to get just Donbass, to get a piece of Ukraine. His purpose is to establish a full control over the entire territory, because he wants to go further. He wants to reestablish the colonial rule of the Soviet Union over all the territories that used to be Russian or Soviet colonies, like in the Baltic countries, across Eastern Europe, and elsewhere. In Africa, as I said, he acts as a neocolonial power, but he acts through colonial means sometimes. In Africa, I explained one of my missions in Africa was to explain the tragedy of the Ukrainian children who have been kidnapped, abducted, and brought, many of them, like thousands of them, brought to camps to be re-educated as soldiers, as child soldiers. And they join eventually what the Russians call Yunarmia, the army of the youth, which now counts over 1.8 million children. Many of them are Ukrainians, abducted Ukrainians, re-educated, brainwashed, re-educated to be the kind of loyal soldiers of Putin. And I ask people in Africa, where do you think they will come to fight, those soldiers? Like in 5 years, when they will be not child soldiers anymore, they will be proper soldiers. Some of them will keep fighting Ukraine, their own parents, their own families. Some of them will be fighting in Europe, probably. But many of them will come to Africa to fight here. Yes, now Russia brings a lot of African students, actually, and children, and not children, youth, young adults to fight in Ukraine, including, like, for example, I know the cases, they invite the children of the priests, Orthodox priests in Africa. They encourage them to switch to the Moscow Patriarchate from the Patriarchate of Alexandria, promising them higher salaries, and they actually pay like twice more to them, but also offering them a possibility to bring their children to study theology in Russia. They come to Russia, their passports are taken, and they are recruited to fight in the front line. So now the Africans come to Africa to fight against Ukraine. Soon, Ukrainians and Russians, but Ukrainians brainwashed Ukrainians, will come to Africa to fight against you. This is a new situation that everyone must be aware. And this is a new colonial and neocolonial war which is coming. It is coming if we don't stop the present colonial war of Putin in Ukraine. If we don't stop it, not the way necessarily how they envisage it here, your neighbors, but if it is not stopped in the just and sustainable way, the colonial wars continue. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father Cyril, for this insightful lecture. And now we are moving to Q&A. So we have microphone.
Stand here, right? Shall we take which question? Maybe you said next one.
So please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll proceed as follows. Try to introduce yourself if you feel comfortable, where you're coming from, your affiliation, and try to keep it concise so we hear as many questions and voices as possible.
Yes, good evening, and thank you for coming to speak to us. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Pastor Eric. I'm come from the Presbyterian. I'm ordained in the PCUSA Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. I am also a Taiwanese American, which is, as you know, there's some analogies there between Ukraine, Russia, Taiwan, China. And I'm also on the board of TBAC, the Taiwanese Benevolence Association, which is one, and other Taiwanese American associations, and have close relationships with the Taiwanese de facto embassy. So my question is this, some context. And as you talk about Ukraine, Russia, neocolonialism, I think that, in my opinion, Ukraine, all around the world, it's basically a proxy neocolonialism. And everyone is in the interests is that the great powers now are all in the work and all advancing all forms of neocolonialism, whether it's Russia, whether it's China or the United States, and particularly even Ukraine. And particularly with regards to colonialism, I mean, in the situation of Taiwan, Now, my grandparents, they lived under the colonialism of Japan, but they preferred actually the colonialism of Japan than the occupation, than when the KMT came to Taiwan. And so in a way, you talk about internal colonialism.
Yeah.
So it's very tricky because, I mean, it's true that Russia is, neocolonialist, but America is too. And so are the other European powers. So how do you really move forward in a way that's free from, I mean, there's really no way to be truly free from neocolonialism in light of global affairs and even internal colonialism.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for this question. Indeed, many people say, look, Russia does what many other countries do. And Russia employs the same ideas that many other countries in Europe used to employ, or nowadays, other kind of the countries like including the United States employ. What is the difference? For me, the difference is the extent of violence, the amount of blood being shed. That is a huge difference. Look, Russia adopted a lot of Western ideas in the beginning. The Soviet Union was driven purely by the Western ideas. Marxism, all the versions of Marxism. In some countries, Marxism worked well. Take the Nordic countries. Like it's an example of left-wing ideas based on Marxism working well for the people. And in Russia, it worked completely different. It created one of the most monstrous dictatorships. That is this is a tradition of Russia. They borrow, ideas from outside. They usually don't invent their own ideas, and they make them into the weapon of mass destruction of their own people, usually. The same is with what is happening now in Ukraine. Russia basically has borrowed the concept of culture wars, including from the United States. And Putin explains this war against Ukraine very much in the terms of how many people in this country explain their culture wars, fighting against decadence for moral values, whatever, families, blah, 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 this sort of traditional values. The rhetoric is very similar, but the praxis is very different. And it has been kind of the Russian tradition. They take ideas. Yesterday in the panel at the Hilton here, where they have those meetings like National Prayer Breakfast and stuff, at the forum by the National Endowment for Democracy, I had a chance to explain this in this way. Look, all the Russian wars, basically all wars, they are like a mine. It has the explosive and they have a fuse. Explosive itself does not explode. If you have like just military machinery, right? It's not enough to start a war. You need to have ideas, and ideas is the fuse in the mine. Some countries, many countries have like a bombshell, explosives, and a fuse. But many countries have those grenades or mines as small. Well, they have local damage. Russians usually have nukes, so that explode and destroy vast territories and a lot of people. And this was the case with Stalin's persecutions, with Stalin's campaigns and purges. It was the case with the Holodomor in Ukraine, which was like an atomic explosion of the country. And the same is the war in Ukraine nowadays. Yeah, of course, why not? Yeah.
As a follow-up question, because I did study about, during the beginning of the war of when Russia invaded, I spent about 200 hours researching from every kind of source. Yeah. It appears to me, I mean, let's just start with the fact that Hunter Biden was on the Ukrainian board on the Ukrainian company, energy company, without any experience. Of
course, yeah.
And because obviously President Biden, then Vice President Biden, was in charge of Ukrainian policy, foreign policy. And of course, it's a very controversial seminal work, which by John Mearsheimer, which basically says, this is all the design of the West. And I would argue that perhaps, my theory, is that the invasion of Ukraine was by design from the U.S. military-industrial complex, because it happened shortly after the war in Afghanistan ended. Yeah. So there is no, and that's not just that doesn't justify anything that Russian did at all. But that revenue source of the military-industrial complex in Afghanistan ended, and very shortly another one began, and we know that that's obviously a lot of weapons. So, do you feel like that factors in at all? I mean, it appears to me Biden administration, did not, which I'm a fan of, but not in Ukraine, did not really have your Ukrainian interest in mind. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Wherever I go in different countries like South America or Africa, and whenever I take a ride on a taxi, sometimes it's Uber, by the way. Yes, very efficient. So I engage in a conversation with the taxi drivers. And regardless of which country it is, wherever I go in the global south, and when I ask, people ask where I'm from, I'm in taxi drivers. I say from Ukraine, and the conversation inevitably starts. And the first reaction from the taxi drivers is, this is America. No, that started the war. Which is, I understand this theory, it exists. But I believe, we in Ukraine feel it doesn't correspond really to reality, because we know who is the perpetrator, who started the war, and who can end it any moment. And there is only one person who can decide it. I mean, it's true. What Blinken said, and you mentioned Blinken's speech, that he said the moment Ukraine, the war will end the moment Putin decides to end it. And when Ukraine decides to end the war, Ukraine will cease to exist. Putin, it's up to Putin completely to stop the war. It's not up to Biden, or up to not even more up to Trump, even though he believes the opposite. Speaking about, I have my own formula, for the American involvement in this war. I sometimes say that Biden's administration helped Ukraine more than it helped Russia, and Trump's administration helps more Russia than it helps Ukraine. That's the difference, basically. But Biden's administration certainly helped Russia, at least to not to kind of collapse when there was a chance for us to make Russia collapse.
Thank you, Father. We have another question.
My name is Natalka Churikova. I used to work for Voice of America for the Ukrainian service, which was closed almost a year ago. Father Cyril, I wanted to thank you for your very insightful lecture, touching upon different geographical areas and historical events as well, and taking a very global view on the Ukrainian events today. You mentioned that colonialism was following the missionaries of the church, historically from the Crusaders in the 16th, 17th century. I would like to ask you if you could dwell upon the Russian Orthodox, the Russian church, and its role in the colonial and neocolonial wars of Russia in Ukraine.
Yes, absolutely. It's very clear, and thank you for bringing this question. It's very clear that the policies of the Russian Church and the Moscow Patriarchate nowadays, it's very colonial, it's very classical. That's how exactly the classical empires of the past, primarily like Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British, they used the church to extend and to solidify their power in the colonies. But again, the Russian formula of power is always more bloody than the previous ones. So the way, the brutality in which this influence is used is really unprecedented, I believe, in many ways. And during the International Religious Freedom Summit that we just had these days here in DC, there were so many examples brought how religion, including the church, instrumentalizes its presence in especially on the occupied territories. Like there was an example, a story told by one of the witnesses that on the occupied territories of Ukraine, they arrested a pastor. He was a Protestant, an evangelical pastor. And the Russian unit that arrested him had a priest as a kind of chaplain. They got drunk after vodka, and they started then like exercise and trying to convert this Protestant pastor into true Christianity, Orthodoxy. And the Orthodox priest used his cross, because we wear crosses, to kind of stuck on the head of this pastor, almost like killing him with a cross because he was drunk, and kind of saying that I will exorcise the demon from you. So this is the way how this colonial policy is being carried out by the Russians. Yeah, typological, it's very similar to what other empires did. But sometimes, and especially in our time, the ways how it is done is much more brutal.
Thank you, Father Cyril. More questions?
So first off, thanks for coming in today. It was very informative. My question would be on the account that you mentioned the neocolonialism reorganization, particularly Chinese involvement in Africa. Even though European powers have diminished their influence from previous times, this new power swoops in.
Yeah.
In terms of Ukraine, it is very dependent on Western funding right now.
Yeah.
And we see the interesting deals, that American administration proposes, especially the one with the minerals.
Yeah.
How much of independence in the future from the West is it acceptable for Ukraine to give up to attain short-term survival goals? And will this change in the next administration?
Yeah.
For the future.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Indeed, it's I'm on H-1B visa in the United States, so I'm in danger of not being allowed to come back to the country, but I don't care. I believe that this policy, especially on the rare minerals in Ukraine, is clearly purely classically neocolonial. But this is American neocolonialism now. I sometimes used to say, like, the two guys act like a gang. One keeps a gun at our head, another strips us of our kind of minerals. They work together, their bodies, basically. You understand who are the guys, right? And of course, this deal has been achieved under duress because we don't have other choice. I attended a meeting with the head of the Ukraine intelligence some time ago, well, like a month ago. And he told us that there are two interpretations of how Ukraine is dependent on the United States, on the supplies from the United States. One version, it's 97% of dependence. Another version, 91%. So without this, we are done. At the same time, I believe we have to fight on the two front lines, basically. Well, of course, we don't have to fight, in the military sense against the American front line, but certainly every diplomatic effort is an effort to rebuke the attempts of the present administration to behave with us, towards us, as kind of a neocolonial power behaves towards a potential kind of colony. And I say sometimes, look, you all said that we are an American puppet. Now you see that we are not American puppets anymore because we have to resist on both sides. And we never were an American puppet. That's the thing.
Thank you. Next question, Professor Merit. And then we can go there.
Yeah, I have a question basically about identity and its history in the region. So if we, say, compare classical colonialism, say the British or the French colonizing in Asia or Africa or the Americas, there is an identitarian difference between the colonizers and the colonized. Whereas I think if I were to say, if there's any kind of lack of comparability here, it is that Putin asserts that the Ukrainian people are fundamentally part of a larger Russian identity, which is not the case in, say, classical colonial situations, right? And so it definitely ties in with Orthodox identity as well, since the foundation of Kievan Rus and all of that, and the derivative nature of the of Muscovy from that ultimately. There's that conception, and it animates his thinking, and it animates the thinking of a lot of Russians too. And so I guess my question is, how do we talk about kind of new colonialism or neocolonialism in the context of a nation that conceives of another nation as basically a constituent part, rather than truly separate?
Excellent question. Thank you. And it may add a new nuance to our conversation, indeed. Because what I'm talking about in the terms, I'm applying this neocolonial terminology to Ukraine. My point is that that's how we explain ourselves to ourselves. That's our language, but it's not the Russian language. Putin does not explain Ukraine to himself or to other Russians in the colonial terms, because exactly for him, we are not a colony. We are them. We are Russians. Well, he takes what he believes belongs to him. And that's why his attitude is not like the British to Nigeria, I don't know, or Germans to Namibia. No, it's not. For him, it's like it's Russia. But for us, it's not. That's why we have a very distinct identity. For us, it's like a clash of identities. We want to protect our identity. We want to protect our language. We want to be ourselves. I bring many examples, like from the global south. One of them is, for example, the situation in Bangladesh, which used to be a part of larger Pakistan until 1971, more or less when they declared independence from what became Western Pakistan. And one of the main reasons was not even religion, because religion is the same, right? But it was the language that defined the difference. And I explained to the students at the University of Dhaka in Bangladesh, I said to them, look, our struggle, what we want to do, we want to speak Bengali. We don't want to speak Urdu. That's one of the points that we try to make. Even though we have the same religion, we look very similarly, but the language different. And the cultural legacy, past, literature, poetry. Rabindranath Tagore, he's not an Indian writer, he's a Bengali writer. We make this point.
Well, I'm speaking on my student's behalf because she lost her voice from a public speaking tournament. And so we're actually—
I can understand that.
Yes, yeah, as a public speaker, yes. So we're actually here on a special interfaith mission to rescue an Iranian Christian refugee trapped in detention.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.
So, because they're Muslim and I'm a Christian pastor, and Catherine is a junior in high school. So we're here on Capitol Hill on a week-long interfaith advocacy for this Iranian Christian who's been wrongfully detained because her husband already received asylum. So we're from Los Angeles. Now, Catherine is her event is called International Extemporaneous Speaking. So she has 30 minutes. She specializes in having 30 minutes to prepare on any question regarding international relations. For example, what can be done to end the war between Russia and Ukraine? That's a question that she would get in competition, and she would have 30 minutes to answer it, 7 minutes.
Yeah.
So her question is, to what extent do you consider Ukraine a post-colonial state, and what aspects of its experience most closely resemble or diverges from classic post-colonial models outside Europe? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, my point is that typologically speaking, as a paradigm, it's very similar. The two experiences are very similar. Of course, the kind of the expressions of this experience, they can be different because we speak different language, we have different stories, histories, and narratives. Yes, we feel we belong to the European milieu. We want to be a part of the European Union, even though the European Union doesn't want very much to us to be a part of it. Because for us, Europe is safety, means safety. For us, Europe means a survival, basically. It's not a luxury. Yes, we are a country, we are a European country, certainly. But we are, that's my point again, we are a European country with a very dense, heavy colonial experience of colonial abuses and neocolonial abuses and colonial wars. That's how we feel.
And we have one online question. What can Ukrainian people in diaspora do to help the decolonization of Ukraine?
Just keep doing what you do, because that's exactly what it's one of the main concerns of the people of the Ukrainian diaspora, I believe. It's to preserve the Ukrainian identity, to preserve Ukrainian kind of self-awareness and language and culture and so forth. And the diaspora has been very good in doing this, and this is the core of decolonization, basically. Of course.
Do you foresee by any point the end of colonial wars? And would they be reshaped in any other ways?
Yeah. As I said in the beginning, to me, colonialism is really like a pendulum. You may feel that it has stopped somewhere at a giant point, but then it continues. But certainly, if this war continues in the way it continues, and if it ends the way, for example, as Trump wants it to end, colonialism will continue for a long time. It will accelerate colonialism further. So we want to do something good to the world, at least not to stop. Let us be realistic, but at least to kind of to slow down this pendulum. We need to contribute to what we call the formula, the just and sustainable peace in Ukraine.
Do we have more questions?
First of all, thank you a lot for the amazing lecture. That's an important topic to discuss. My name is Dr. Nazar Savak. I'm coming from Regent University. My question would be, what are the differences you see from the Russian colonial war and the way they wage wars and the previous colonial wars we saw? Piggybacking on some of the questions previously, how does the perceived Russian view that the Ukrainian is a intrinsic part of Russia play in those differences? And one example that came up to me is the war between France and Algeria, when France actually perceived Algeria as a part of France rather than a
part of the country. Yeah, exactly. Well, I think the feature of all Russian colonialist efforts has been always that they never perceived them as colonial efforts. However, speaking objectively, academically, from the perspective of colonial studies, post-colonial studies, all those efforts were colonial efforts. But they were always delusioned, and still are delusioned, that they were never colonial. And when Putin said this, I think it was like Eastern Partnership in Vladivostok, that he made a statement that Russia was never a colonial power. He believed it. He said, he would say, yes, of course. And he believes it. It's not just like, lying. But the thing is that he expresses this kind of self-perception of many Russians that they were always on the good side of history, never on the colonial side of the history, but they were, and they still are. And probably because they never perceive themselves as a colonial power, they keep being a colonial power. A bit louder because you can't. The mic is not on.
Yes, thank you for your time, for coming, and thanks, Natalia, for organizing this event. I'm from Georgia, so my question is, how do you see this classical colonialism or maybe new colonialism playing out in Georgia, and how do you think it is different or maybe similar to Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. Well, I believe just like in Ukraine, the Maidans were anti-colonial manifestations. So the Revolution of Roses was in Tbilisi was an anti-colonial event, a huge anti-colonial event with many consequences. And as a result of that, Putin started a colonial war when he occupied 20% of the Georgian territory, including Abkhazia and Ossetia. And this occupation is continuing, like step by step. But then what he managed to do, through the Georgian Dream, through Ivanishvili regime, I think, he managed to establish a neocolonial control over Georgia. Basically, Georgia is now a neocolonial state. Formally, it is independent, but it's so much dependent in reality on Russia. So Georgia has a double situation, just like Ukraine has. Ukraine has this double situation of, or had before 2022. Crimea as like a colonial control, classical colonial control, and then Donbass as a kind of proxy neocolonial control. Georgia has the same colonial control over Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and neocolonial control over Tbilisi through Ivanishvili's regime. That would be my take on it.
And we have time for 1-2 final questions, so maybe there and then here.
And I want to thank you myself too, this previous question. Thank you very much for this lecture. Very interesting. It made me puzzle about the future of humanity and society, if we will ever, get rid of the colonialism. But let's be realistic rather than idealistic. And in this vision, I would like to ask you: do you think Russian colonialism will stop with end of Putin's era, realistically speaking?
Yeah, thank you. Well, it has to do with how we define our victory in Ukraine, which is a very big question nowadays for us that we discuss. How we define this victory. My definition of our victory, first of all, I believe it's not going to be a quick victory. It's going to be a long victory, a long-term victory. Okay? And we can say that we have won when Russia ceases to be as a colonial power. That will be the criterion for victory for us. I think it is possible, and I believe it will happen. And I believe another way to define it is Russia will stop to be a colonial power when it will stop colonizing internally the areas around it or inside it, not because it doesn't want it, but because it cannot do it. When it will go from Georgia, will leave Georgia alone, when the occupied territories will be free finally and reconnected, rejoined with the rest of Georgia, when Transnistria will go back to Moldova, and so forth and so on.
The last question, please.
Thank you again. So I guess the last question I was wondering about was basically a kind of a spiritual one within the Orthodox communion. And I'm wondering, is there any way for the broader Orthodox global community to contribute to the changing of hearts and minds in a path towards something like repentance among some sectors of the ecclesial establishment in Russia?
Yeah, exactly. Well, that was a sort of question that I received yesterday in the end of my presentation. Of course, it did not follow, but I will tell you. My kind of recipe for the Orthodox contribution to the situation, I expressed in 2 Greek words. One is catharsis, which is understandable, right? And catharsis can be achieved through justice, through delivering, serving justice. Without justice, there will be no catharsis, which is a very Orthodox term, right? Eastern Christians, Greek. Natalia will know more about and knows more about this term through her doctoral studies. Another one is metanoia, repentance. Another Greek word, which is very deeply rooted in our spirituality, which we usually apply to others, usually not to ourselves. It's time to apply it to ourselves. that we need to repent for what has happened. So far, the Orthodox churches are not the contributors, facilitators of peace and justice, but they are rather the enablers of violence and colonization. Not all of them, but most of them, unfortunately.
Thank you so much for your excellent questions. And thank you, Father Cyril, for joining us here in Georgetown. Thank you for your excellent and thought-provoking lecture and discussion. And before we close, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to the Department of Theology and Religious Studies, especially to Professors Prevot and Dodson, who helped us and guided us in bringing this event to campus. I also would like to thank all our co-sponsors and partners, our student volunteers, and especially the team of the Georgetown Interfaith Society, including Helen, Elsa, and Benjamin. These are people who are working behind the scenes with logistics, organization to help this event happen. Please join me in thanking them with a round of applause. And please join us for light refreshments outside for some informal conversation. And also, if you would like to follow our future events, you can scan the QR code at the exit to follow us on social media and to sign up for our newsletter. And thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful evening.
And we must thank Natalia, of course, for putting it together.